In January of 1945, Soviet forces entered what remained of Warsaw and found something that experienced soldiers. Men who had fought through Stalingrad and Kursk and across thousands of kilometers of the Eastern Front were not prepared for. They had seen cities destroyed by war, buildings collapsed by artillery, streets cratered by bombs, facades blackened by fire. That kind of destruction has a particular quality. It is chaotic. It follows the logic of battle, concentrated here, lighter there, following the lines of advance and retreat. Warsaw did not look like that. Warsaw looked like something else entirely. Block after block, in every direction. The buildings were simply gone. Not damaged, not burned. Gone. Reduced to flat rubble with a consistency and thoroughness that no artillery exchange or aerial bombardment produces. What the soldiers were looking at was not the result of fighting. It was the result of a decision. Specialists had moved through this city after the fighting was over, building by building, street by street, with demolition charges and blueprints and written orders, and they had unmade it. One kind of destruction comes from war. What happened to Warsaw came from intention. 85% of the city's structures were gone. The libraries were ash. The royal castle had been blown up stone by engineers who knew exactly what they were doing. As few as 1,000 people remained in a city that had held more than 1 million. And then, a nation, living under Soviet-backed rule, looked at the rubble of its capital and made a decision that defies every rational calculation. They were going to build it back, not something new, not something modern and practical and forward-looking, exactly what had been there before, stone by stone, painting by painting, memory by memory. This is the story of Warsaw, the city that was erased, and the city that refused to stay erased. Chapter 1. The River and the Dukes. Stand on the western bank of the Vistula in Warsaw on a clear morning and watch the water move. The river is wider here than most first-time visitors expect. Wide enough that the far bank feels genuinely distant. Wide enough that the light off the surface on a summer day reaches all the way up the bluff to the painted facades of the old town above. The current moves with the patient authority of something that has been doing this for longer than any human settlement on either bank. That river is the reason Warsaw exists, and for the first 2 centuries of the city's life, it is also the reason Warsaw did not matter to anyone who did not already live there. To understand what the Vistula meant to the people who first settled its banks, you have to understand what moving anything across medieval Europe actually required. There were no railroads. There were no paved roads in any modern sense. There were tracks that turned to mud in the rain and froze into ridged obstacles in winter. Moving grain or timber or salt or iron in any significant quantity meant moving it by water. The rivers of Central Europe were the highways on which everything that mattered actually travelled. And the Vistula, running roughly 600 miles from the mountains of the south to the Baltic Sea in the north, was the main artery of the Polish interior. Any settlement that controlled a crossing point on that river controlled something genuinely valuable. The ability to tax and regulate the flow of commerce moving in both directions, the ability to know who was coming and from where and what they were carrying. The site where Warsaw eventually grew was not the most dramatic crossing on the river. It was not the widest or the narrowest, but it sat at a point where the natural geography of the eastern bank provided reasonable ground for approach, and the western bluff offered a defensible position for anyone willing to build there. A community on that bluff could watch the river in both directions. It could charge for the crossing. It could turn away people it did not want. The people who recognized this were the Mazovian dukes, the regional rulers of the territory surrounding the Middle Vistula, Mazovia was not a glamorous duchy. It was not the center of anything in particular. The real power in the Polish lands in the 13th and 14th centuries was concentrated further south and west. In Kraków, the city that served as the actual capital of the Polish kingdom and the seat of its kings. Warsaw, in those early centuries, was a provincial town in a provincial duchy, the kind of place that mattered deeply to the people who lived there and almost no one else. The earliest documented reference to Warsaw as a settlement dates to around 1300, though the actual habitation of the site is certainly older. What the documents describe is modest: a trading post, a market, a crossing point with some fortifications on the bluff above the river. The Mazovian dukes built a castle there, not because Warsaw was important, but because it was theirs, and they needed somewhere to stay when they passed through. What those dukes had built in, without fully understanding it, was a location that sat at the intersection of the major north-south and east-west trade routes crossing the flat Mazovian plain. Archaeological evidence from the surrounding region suggests that by the 14th century, the market at Warsaw was receiving goods from the Baltic coast to the north, from the Silesian mining regions to the southwest, and from the agricultural hinterlands in multiple directions. The Mazovian dukes had built their modest castle in a better location than they knew. Walk to the edge of the bluff in the old town today and look down at the river. The castle that rises behind you is, in its current physical form, a reconstruction completed in the 1980s, rebuilt from rubble and from architectural drawings and photographs that Polish museum workers had hidden from the German demolition units 4 decades earlier. But the foundations beneath it are original. The logic of its position, the river below, the bluff above, the crossing within sight in both directions, is the same logic that the Mazovian dukes understood 700 years ago. You can read it in the landscape if you know what you are looking at. The medieval town that grew around the castle followed patterns that any visitor to a well-preserved Central European city would recognize. A market square at the center, surrounded by merchant houses whose owners competed for frontage on the most commercially valuable ground. Streets running outward in patterns determined partly by planning and mostly by the accumulated decisions of people who simply needed to get from one place to another efficiently. A parish church, then a second, then a third as the population grew. Walls eventually, because a town without walls in the medieval period was an invitation to anyone who wanted what it had. What Warsaw had, in those early centuries, was access. Access to the river trade moving north toward the Baltic and south toward the mountains. Access to the road networks crossing the flat Mazovian plain. Access to the agricultural production of the surrounding territory, which fed the town and gave its merchants something to sell to the traders passing through. What Warsaw did not have was political significance beyond its immediate region. That was Kraków, where the kings were crowned and the ambassadors arrived and the decisions that shaped Polish history were made. Warsaw was secondary, useful to those who needed it, largely irrelevant to those who did not. This would continue for the better part of 2 centuries. And then, in 1526, the Mazovian dynasty died out. The last of the dukes left no heir. Mazovia and its modest capital passed directly to the Polish crown. For Warsaw, this transfer was the first movement of a door that was about to swing all the way open. Not immediately. The court remained in Kraków. The great institutions of Polish power stayed where they had always been. But Warsaw's legal status had changed in ways that would, over the following decades, create the conditions for a transformation that had nothing to do with the river or the castle or the accumulated logic of medieval geography. It would have to do with a and with a problem that one of the largest states in Europe desperately needed to solve. Chapter 2. The Accident of Capital. There is a particular kind of importance that cities acquire, not because they deserve it, but because they happen to be in the right place when someone with power needs to solve a problem. Warsaw's rise to capital status was exactly that kind of importance. It was not earned through centuries of cultural achievement or the accumulated prestige of great institutions. It was the answer to a geometry problem. Picture a map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the height of its power in the mid-16th century. It stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the edges of the Black Sea steppe in the south, from the borders of the Holy Roman Empire in the west to the territories of Muscovy in the east. It was one of the largest states in Europe, containing within its borders Poles and Lithuanians and Ruthenians and Germans and Tatars and Armenians, and one of the largest Jewish populations anywhere in the world. Now put your finger on Krakow, the royal capital, in the far southwest corner of that enormous territory. A Lithuanian nobleman travelling to the royal court faced weeks of travel across some of the worst roads in Central Europe. A Ruthenian landowner with business before the royal chancellery faced the same. A diplomat arriving from the eastern territories might not complete the journey before the season turned the roads to mud. The capital of the Commonwealth was, for a substantial portion of its population, practically unreachable for most of the year. The Polish-Lithuanian nobility, who held genuine political power through the institution of the Sejm, the parliamentary assembly that conducted the business of the state, had already been rotating their meetings between different cities for years. Warsaw had hosted sessions since the 1540s, partly because its central location made it more accessible to the Lithuanian nobility than Krakow, partly because the royal castle provided adequate space for the kind of assembly the Sejm required. Then came 1596, and King Sigismund III. Sigismund is a complicated figure in Polish historical memory. He was Swedish by birth, a Catholic king in a country whose nobility included large numbers of Protestants, a monarch whose ambitions repeatedly exceeded his political judgment. History has not been uniformly kind to him, but his decision to move the permanent royal court from Krakow to Warsaw was simply correct, and it remade the city in ways that his successors spent the next 2 centuries building on. The arrival of the royal court changed Warsaw from a moderately prosperous market town into something qualitatively different within a single generation. Courts required administrators, and administrators required housing and offices and the supporting services that urban economies provide. Courts required diplomats, and diplomats required ceremonial spaces and the infrastructure of international relations. Courts required craftsmen and artists and architects and musicians, because the prestige of a royal court in the early modern period was expressed through the quality of the cultural life surrounding it. All of this arrived in Warsaw after 1596 with a speed that the existing town was completely unprepared for. The royal castle was expanded and renovated in the early Baroque style, sweeping through the Catholic courts of Europe. New palaces went up along the streets surrounding it, built by the great magnate families who needed to maintain a presence near the court. Churches were rebuilt in the Italian Baroque manner, their facades designed by architects brought from Italy and Germany and the Low Countries. Warsaw in the early 17th century was a construction site of almost continuous activity, its skyline changing from decade to decade as the institutions of a capital materialized out of the Mazovian plain. The population grew with a speed that contemporary observers found remarkable. Estimates for Warsaw, at the moment of the court's arrival, hover around 10,000 to 15,000 people. By the middle of the 17th century, the city held perhaps 30,000, and the character of that population had changed as dramatically as its size. Dutch traders with connections to the Baltic grain trade established themselves in the new capital. German craftsmen arrived with skills the expanding city needed. Armenian merchants, whose commercial networks stretched across the eastern trade routes into Persia and beyond, found Warsaw a useful base. Italian architects and artists came with the court and stayed, and the Jewish population, which had been present in the surrounding towns and villages of Mazovia for generations, grew alongside the commercial opportunities the new capital created. The Jewish community of Warsaw in this period deserves particular attention, not only because of what it was in the 17th century, but because of what it would become. Jewish settlement in the Polish lands had a history stretching back centuries. Driven by the relative tolerance of the Polish crown compared to the systematic persecution that had expelled Jewish communities from most of Western Europe. By the early 17th century, Poland contained the largest Jewish population in the world. Warsaw itself had complicated legal restrictions on Jewish residents within the city walls, but Jewish merchants and traders operated in the immediate suburbs and surrounding towns. Their commercial networks threaded through the economic life of the capital in ways that made any sharp boundary between the city and its Jewish community largely fictional in practice. The cosmopolitan character of Warsaw in this period is difficult to overstate. Walk through the central streets of the new capital in the 1620s and you would hear Polish and German and Yiddish and Italian and Armenian. You would pass buildings whose architectural details reflected the tastes of a dozen different European traditions filtered through the Baroque idiom that had become the international language of Catholic power and prestige. The city was pulling in people and ideas and goods from every direction, because the gravitational force of a royal capital attracts everything toward itself. And then, in the same decade that this new Warsaw was asserting itself, a painter arrived who would spend years documenting what the city looked like with a precision that no one at the time understood was going to matter enormously. His name was Bernardo Bellotto. He was the nephew of the great Venetian urban painter known as Canaletto, and he came to Warsaw in 1767 at the invitation of King Stanislaus August. He painted the city with the accuracy of an architect rather than the impressionism of a landscape painter. His canvases recorded the exact dimensions of window openings, the specific profiles of decorative cornices, the precise colours of facades, and the patterns of roof tiles. 170 years later, those paintings would serve as the blueprints for the reconstruction of a city reduced to rubble. The architects of post-war Warsaw would measure his canvases, extrapolate dimensions from his painted perspective, and use his documented details to resolve disputes about what specific building elements had looked like before they were blown up. Bellotto did not know he was doing this. He was simply doing his job, but the job he did saved something that nothing else could have saved. Stand in the Old Town Market Square today and look at the painted facades of the merchant houses surrounding you. They look old. They look like they have always been there. They are, in their current physical form, younger than most of the people visiting them, rebuilt in the 1940s and 1950s from rubble and from those 18th century paintings. But the proportions are accurate. The colours follow historical documentation. The arrangement of windows and decorative details reproduces what stood here before someone tried to make sure it could never exist again. The Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791, proclaimed in the Great Hall of the Royal Castle that Bellotto had painted 2 decades earlier, was among the most significant constitutional documents of the 18th century. It addressed the structural weaknesses that had paralysed the Commonwealth, strengthened the executive, reformed the Sejm, extended rights to previously excluded groups. It was a genuine achievement of Enlightenment political thought applied to the specific problems of a specific country. it came too late. Russia and Prussia responded to the constitution as they had always responded to Polish attempts at self-strengthening, with force. A second partition in 1793 took more territory. A national uprising led by Tadeusz Kościuszko in 1794 attempted to resist the process and came closer to success than its opponents had expected, winning significant early battles before ultimately failing against overwhelming Russian force. In 1795, the three neighbouring powers completed what they had begun 23 years earlier. Poland was erased from the map of Europe. Warsaw, the city that had become a capital in 1596 and had spent 2 centuries building the institutions and culture and identity of a capital, was no longer the capital of anything. The royal castle stood empty of its king. There was no Poland. There was a Russian administrative city called Warsaw in the western provinces of the Russian Empire. The last king of Poland, Stanisław August, abdicated and went into Russian captivity. He died in St. Petersburg in 1798. The palace at Łazienki that he had built as his summer residence on the southern edge of Warsaw, a neoclassical jewel set on an island in an artificial lake surrounded by formal gardens, still stands today. In summer, outdoor concerts are held there, and Varsovians come to sit on the grass and listen to Chopin played in the shadow of the palace of the last king of their country. It is a very Polish kind of commemoration, finding beauty in the reminder of something that was lost. Sitting in the garden of a dead king and listening to music composed by a man who left Poland and never came back, because the Poland he had known no longer existed in any legal or political form. Warsaw had survived the Swedish invasion. It had built cathedrals and palaces and libraries and theatres and produced some of the most significant political thinking of the 18th century. Now it had to survive the disappearance of the country it belonged to, and it would have to do it for 123 years. Chapter 3. The Deluge and the Slow Decline. Close your eyes for a moment and try to hold 2 images in your mind at the same time. The first image is Warsaw in the summer of 1655. The royal castle is at the height of its early splendour. The market square below it is full of the noise and movement of a functioning capital. Merchants from a dozen countries. The smell of horses and bread and river water. The sound of Polish and German and Yiddish and Italian mixing in the warm air of a city that has spent 60 years becoming itself. The second image is Warsaw 4 months later. Swedish soldiers are quartered in the castle. The great hall where the sage had met is being used as a barracks. Wagons are being loaded in the courtyard with objects that were not the Swedes to take. Among them, carefully packed in straw, the contents of the royal library, artworks, manuscripts, scientific instruments accumulated by Polish monarchs over generations, things that were taken north to Sweden and that would spend the next centuries in Stockholm. The Swedish invasion of 1655, the event that Poles call Potop, the Deluge, was not the first catastrophe Warsaw had faced. It would not be the last, but it was the first demonstration of something that would repeat itself, with variations, for the next 300 years, that the city's location, the very geography that had made it a capital, also made it one of the most accessible targets in Central Europe for any army moving from the north or the east or the west. Sweden invaded in 1655 under King Charles X, Gustav, with a speed and force that the Polish military was completely unable to meet. Within weeks they were moving through territory that had never seen foreign soldiers. Within months they had reached Warsaw. The city fell without a siege. The Mazovian nobility, calculating that resistance was impossible, submitted. What the Swedish army took from Warsaw was a cultural catastrophe from which the city never fully recovered in the 17th century. The castle was stripped of artwork, furniture, tapestries, silverware, books, scientific instruments. The great library collections that Polish monarchs had accumulated over generations were packed onto wagons and sent north. Some of those objects are in Swedish museums today. The accounting of what was lost has never been fully completed because so much of what was taken left no record behind it. Warsaw was not finished yet. The occupation provoked the kind of national resistance that its speed was supposed to prevent. King John II Casimir, who had fled when the Swedes arrived, issued his famous Vows of Love in 1656, combining military resolve with religious devotion in a manner that would characterize Polish resistance to foreign occupation for the next 3 centuries. Swedish forces were pushed back. Warsaw changed hands multiple times over the following years. The city was burned, occupied, liberated, burned again. By the time the conflict wound down in 1660, Warsaw had been physically damaged in ways that took generations to repair. The second half of the 17th century was a period of reconstruction and adjustment. The population had fallen sharply during the wars. Buildings damaged in the fighting were slowly repaired. The court returned. The market in the old town began operating again. But the confidence of the early 17th century did not fully return, because the Commonwealth itself was entering a structural weakness that no individual king or political reform could reverse. The institution of the liberum veto, by which any single member of the Sejm could block legislation and dissolve the entire assembly, made coherent governance increasingly difficult. The great magnate families, whose private armies made them more powerful than many European monarchs, had little incentive to strengthen a central government that constrained their autonomy. Foreign powers learned that the Commonwealth could be manipulated from within by bribing individual nobles to exercise their veto, and they used this knowledge with increasing frequency and confidence. Here is a specific measure of what this produced. In the mid-17th century, before the Swedish invasion, the Commonwealth had maintained a professional army of respectable size. By the early 18th century, decades of failed Sejm sessions and blocked military budgets had reduced that army to a fraction of what neighbouring states were fielding. Prussia, which had been a secondary power when Warsaw became a capital, was by the 1730s building the most disciplined military force in Europe. The Commonwealth, meanwhile, could not pass a defence budget that any single nobleman could not veto on a whim. Warsaw in the 18th century was therefore the capital of a state being slowly paralysed by its own political arrangements, while its neighbours grew stronger and more predatory. To the east, Russia, under Peter I and his successors, was transforming itself into a major European power. To the west, Prussia was building that formidable military machine. To the south, Austria watched the weakening Commonwealth with patient interest. And yet Warsaw in this same period was one of the most intellectually alive cities on the continent. Stanisław August Poniatowski, who became the last king of Poland in 1764, was in many respects the wrong man for the political moment his country faced. He was a brilliant patron of the arts, a man of genuine Enlightenment convictions who corresponded with Voltaire and supported institutional reforms that progressive European opinion admired. He was not, and never became, the kind of ruthless political operator the Commonwealth situation required. But under his patronage, Warsaw experienced a cultural flowering that was genuinely remarkable. The Theatre Royal opened. The first public library in Polish history was established. Painters and architects and musicians gathered at the royal court in numbers that made the city a genuine participant in the European Enlightenment. All of this was happening while the political structure surrounding it was collapsing. Russia, Prussia, and Austria began their systematic dismemberment of the Commonwealth in 1772 with what historians call the First Partition. Large territories were simply annexed by the three neighbouring powers. The Commonwealth lost roughly 30% of its territory and a third of its population in a single diplomatic transaction. The shock produced reform energy. The Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791, attempted to address the structural weaknesses that had made the Commonwealth vulnerable. It came too late. Russia and Prussia responded with force. Kosciuszko's uprising of 1794 failed. In 1795, the process was complete. Poland was erased. The palace at Łazienki still stands. The concerts still happen on summer evenings. The Chopin music still carries across the water of the artificial lake to the people sitting on the grass. Walk back into the city from those gardens, and you are walking the same route that the last king of Poland walked when he left Łazienki for the final time in 1795. He knew he was not coming back. He could not have known that the city would still be here 230 years later. Its castle rebuilt from rubble. Its squares full of people living their ordinary lives in a country that came back from the dead. He was the last king of a country that would return. He simply did not live to see it. Chapter 4. The City Without a Country. On a winter morning in Warsaw in 1840, a child walks to school. The school is in an ordinary building on an ordinary street. The teacher stands at the front of the room and begins the lesson. The language of instruction is Russian. The history being taught is Russian history. The maps on the wall show the Russian Empire, and within it, with no special marking, the territory where the child lives. There is no Poland on that map. After school, the child walks home. In the kitchen, the mother is cooking. She speaks to the child in Polish. She shows the child a book, kept behind other books on the shelf, that tells a different story. She explains, quietly, that the language the school is trying to replace is the language of this family, of this street, of this city, and that learning it and keeping it is not an act of politics. It is an act of survival. This scene, repeated in thousands of Warsaw kitchens across the 19th century, is the central fact of what the Russian Empire's occupation of Warsaw actually meant in practice. Not the administrative structures, not the tax arrangements, the daily decision of ordinary families to remain in their own homes, themselves, for 123 years. From 1795 to 1918, Poland did not exist as a sovereign state. Warsaw existed as an administrative centre of the Russian Empire, governed by Russian officials, policed by Russian soldiers, subject to Russian laws that were periodically tightened depending on how much trouble the Polish population had caused recently. The Russian Empire's approach alternated between relative tolerance and intense repression. What drove this alternation was not a change of heart in St. Petersburg. It was the repeated refusal of the Polish population to accept that what had happened in 1795 was permanent. The Uprising of 1830 was the first major test. Polish officers in the Russian Imperial Army launched an insurrection in November of 1830 that quickly spread into a broad national uprising. Russian forces were pushed out of Warsaw. A provisional government was established. For several months, Warsaw was again, in practice, if not in international law, the capital of a Polish state. The Russian response, when it came in 1831, was overwhelming. The Polish forces, fighting without significant support from any European power, were defeated. What followed was repression more systematic than anything that had preceded it. The Polish constitution was abolished. Polish administrative institutions were dissolved. The University of Warsaw was closed. Thousands of Poles were deported to Siberia, and the schools began teaching in Russian. This measure was aimed at something more fundamental than political loyalty. Language is not simply a tool of communication. It is the structure through which a culture organizes its understanding of its own history and identity. A child who cannot read or write in the language of its parents is a child being slowly disconnected from everything that came before. The Russian Empire understood this. The prohibition on Polish language instruction was not an administrative measure. It was an attempt to interrupt the transmission of Polish identity across generations. It failed because of mothers. The underground educational networks that developed across the second half of the 19th century in Russian-controlled Warsaw were one of the most remarkable acts of cultural resistance in modern European history. Sustained not by professional revolutionaries or political organizations, but by ordinary families making private decisions in their own kitchens about what their children would know and who their children would be. The historical record from this period captures something of the absurdity the occupation produced. Russian imperial school inspectors visiting Warsaw in the latter decades of the 19th century repeatedly noted the gap between official compliance and daily reality. Students who demonstrated no knowledge of Polish in formal inspections would be heard speaking it fluently among themselves in the corridors. The inspectors noted this. The families knew the inspectors noted this. Both sides maintained the fiction because neither had a better option. The empire could not force a language out of existence in private homes, and the families could not openly defy an empire. So the language survived in the space between official reality and actual reality, which is precisely where Polish identity had always survived. The Uprising of 1863 was the second great test, and in some respects more tragic than the first, because it was more clearly doomed from the beginning. The January Uprising began as a series of guerrilla actions against Russian forces and spread across the Polish territories over more than a year. It never achieved the organized military strength that would have given it a realistic chance against the Russian army. The repression that followed was the most severe Warsaw had experienced. Thousands were executed. Tens of thousands were deported to Siberia. The Russian Orthodox Church built a massive cathedral in the central square of Warsaw, a physical statement of imperial authority placed at the symbolic heart of a Catholic city. That cathedral was demolished after Polish independence was restored in 1918. The decision was immediate and unanimous. Some buildings carry meaning beyond their architecture. Warsaw, in the second half of the 19th century, was simultaneously a city under severe political pressure and a city undergoing rapid economic transformation. The Industrial Revolution arrived in the Russian-controlled Polish territories in the 1860s and 70s, with the force it had already demonstrated in Britain and Western Europe. Textile factories appeared south and west of the old city. Metalworks and engineering firms followed. The population, which had stabilized at around 150,000 in the mid-19th century, began growing with the speed that industrial employment always generated. By 1900, Warsaw had a population of approximately 700,000 people. It was one of the largest cities in the Russian Empire, with electric trams and gas lighting and department stores and a press that published in Polish despite official restrictions. And the Jewish community of Warsaw in this period had become the largest urban Jewish community in the world. By 1900, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 Jewish residents lived in Warsaw and its immediate suburbs. They published newspapers in Yiddish and Hebrew and Polish. They maintained schools and theatres and charitable organisations and political parties, spanning the entire spectrum from orthodox religious conservatism to secular socialist radicalism. They were, in every meaningful sense, Warsavians, shaped by the same river and the same streets and the same complicated history as every other group in the city, and at the same time maintaining a distinct cultural life of extraordinary richness. The writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, who grew up in Warsaw in the early 20th century and would later win the Nobel Prize in Literature, described the city of his childhood as a place where every conversation contained the whole of human experience, where the density of people and ideas and conflicts and aspirations in a relatively small space produced a quality of life that was exhausting and irreplaceable in equal measure. That quality was built across 123 years of occupation and resistance and cultural stubbornness and underground education and the daily decision of millions of people to remain, in some essential way, themselves. And then, in November of 1918, something that three empires had insisted was impossible became real. Poland came back. The circumstances were almost accidental in their timing. The First World War had destroyed all three of the empires that had divided Poland among themselves in 1795. Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary were simultaneously collapsing under the weight of 4 years of industrial-scale killing. In the chaos of their simultaneous disintegration, the political structures that had kept Poland erased from the map simply ceased to function. On the 11th of November 1918, the same day the armistice ended the fighting on the Western Front, Polish forces in Warsaw disarmed the German garrison that had occupied the city since 1915. Józef Piłsudski, the military and political leader who had spent decades organizing Polish resistance to all three occupying powers, arrived in Warsaw and was recognized as the head of the new Polish state. Warsaw was a capital again. Walk today to the palace on the Isle at Łazienki, where the last king of Poland had listened to music and watched his country disappear. The same lake, the same gardens, the same neoclassical facade reflected in the same water. The outdoor stage where Chopin concerts are held in summer is full-on warm evenings with people sitting on the grass. Families and young couples and tourists and old Warsavians who have been coming here for decades. They are sitting in the garden of a country that came back. 123 years is a long time to wait. The city that waited had developed, in that time, a capacity for persistence that no other century of its history had required, and that no other century would be able to take away. Chapter 5. 20 Years of Everything. Begin not with a date or a political event, but with a sound. It is an evening in the early 1930s, somewhere in the centre of Warsaw. The windows of a cafe on Nowy Świat Street are fogged with warmth from the inside, and through them, if you stop on the pavement and listen, you can hear a jazz band working through an American standard. The music comes out through the glass imperfectly, softened and slightly muffled, mixing with the sound of tram bells and the ordinary noise of a city that has been doing this, being alive in public, for 15 years now, after 123 years of doing it in secret and at risk. Inside that cafe, people are arguing. They are arguing about politics and about art, and about whether the avant-garde movement coming out of Paris can be genuinely adapted to Polish conditions, or whether adaptation is itself a form of surrender. They are arguing in Polish and in Yiddish, and occasionally in French, when someone wants to sound more authoritative than their Polish allows. Nobody wants to go home. Nobody has wanted to go home in Warsaw cafes since 1918, because going home means the conversation stops, And the conversation is one of the things this city has been waiting to have out loud for a very long time. This is what Warsaw's 20 interwar years felt like from the inside. Not as a historical period to be studied, but as a life to be lived. A compressed and urgent life. Because somewhere underneath the jazz and the arguments and the department stores and the new ministry buildings going up along the central boulevards, a significant number of people sensed, without being able to name it precisely, that the time available was limited. Poland had come back in 1918 with the overwhelming relief of a country that had been waiting for its own existence for 123 years. And Warsaw, as its restored capital, absorbed that relief and converted it into a cultural energy that astonished even the people generating it. By the mid-1920s, the city had rebuilt its basic infrastructure and established its governmental institutions. By the early 1930s, Warsaw was a genuinely modern European capital, with a skyline that mixed Baroque churches and neoclassical palaces with Art Deco apartment buildings and functionalist office blocks that would have looked at home in Amsterdam or Vienna. The architectural ambition of the period was extraordinary. The architects working in Warsaw in these years were educated in Vienna and Paris and Berlin, and brought back the international currents of modernism and Art Deco and the various hybrid styles that characterized the most adventurous European architecture of the interwar decades. New ministry buildings went up along the central boulevards. Department stores appeared on Marszałkowska Street, their glass facades announcing a consumer culture that was, for the first time, able to operate without the oversight of an imperial administration. The cultural life that filled these new spaces had a quality that survivors who lived to describe it always spoke of, with a combination of joy and grief that is difficult to separate. Warsaw in the 1920s and 30s was a city of literary magazines publishing experimental poetry alongside political argument, of theatre companies staging productions that would have been considered avant-garde anywhere in Europe. Polish writers and painters and composers of genuine international significance were working in the city during this period, producing work that was fully engaged with the European modernist conversation while remaining rooted in specifically Polish experience. The Jewish cultural life of Warsaw in this period was a civilization unto itself. By 1939, the Jewish population of Warsaw stood at approximately 380,000 people, roughly 30% of the city's total population, and the largest urban Jewish community in Europe. They published daily newspapers in Yiddish with circulations that would be respectable by the standards of any major city. The YIVO Institute for Jewish Research maintained a major Warsaw presence, producing scholarship of permanent value. The Yiddish theatre in Warsaw was internationally recognized as among the finest in the world. Think about what that actually means. In the city that would within a few years become the site of the largest Jewish ghetto in history, the Jewish community in the 1930s was running a civilization, schools and hospitals and orphanages, political parties debating the future of Judaism and of Jewish nationhood, writers producing novels and poems in a language that their grandparents had been told was a mere dialect, children growing up speaking 3 languages before they turned 10. The political life of the new Polish state was turbulent in ways that reflected the difficulty of building democratic institutions in a country that had no recent experience of governing itself. The parliamentary democracy established in 1918 was chaotic and often ineffective. In 1926, Józef Pilsudski staged a coup and established an authoritarian government. Press freedoms were curtailed. Political opponents were harassed and sometimes imprisoned. But the cultural life of the city continued with remarkable vitality through all of it. The cafes stayed open. The magazines kept publishing. The jazz kept playing. The event that deserves to be far better known than it is in the English-speaking world happened not in the cultural sphere, but on the military one. In the summer of 1921, the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921 was one of the most consequential military conflicts of the 20th century, and it has been almost entirely forgotten outside Poland. The newly established Soviet state moved westward with the explicit intention of spreading revolutionary communism into Central Europe. The Red Army advanced through the summer of 1920 with a speed that brought it to the outskirts of Warsaw by August. The fall of Warsaw seemed not merely possible but probable to most military observers. The French military mission in Poland was preparing for evacuation. What happened on the banks of the Vistula in August of 1920 is remembered in Poland as the miracle on the Vistula. Polish forces, reorganized and counter-attacking with a strategic boldness that the Red Army's overextended supply lines had made possible, struck the flanks of the Soviet advance and destroyed it as a coherent fighting force. The Soviet advance was not merely halted, it was reversed in a defeat so complete that it ended Soviet military ambitions in Central Europe for a generation. The historical significance of what happened in those fields around Warsaw in August of 1920 is not primarily military. The significance is in what would have followed a Soviet victory. A communist Poland in 1920 would have been a Soviet-aligned state on the western border of the Soviet Union, removing the buffer that separated Soviet power from Germany. The political history of Europe between the wars and the conditions under which the rise of Nazism occurred would have been fundamentally different. The miracle on the Vistula did not only save Poland. There is a serious historical argument that it changed the trajectory of the entire 20th century. The Warsaw of 1939, on the eve of what was coming, was a city of 1,300,000 people. It had grown faster than almost any other European capital in the interwar period. Its streets held a cultural life of extraordinary density and richness. They knew something was wrong. The news from Germany since 1933 had been impossible to misread for anyone paying attention. The Munich Agreement of 1938 had demonstrated what the Western powers were willing to sacrifice to avoid confrontation. The Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, signed on the 23rd of August 1939, contained a secret protocol dividing Poland between them. Almost no one in Warsaw knew the specific contents of that secret protocol. Almost everyone understood that its signing meant something terrible was about to happen. Back in that cafe on Nowy Świat Street, in those last days of August 1939, the conversations had changed. The arguments about art and politics were still happening. The coffee was still strong. The jazz was still playing somewhere down the street. But underneath everything, audible to anyone paying attention, was the particular silence of people who understood that this specific version of life, the arguments and the magazines and the freedom to argue about anything in public, was running out of time. On the 1st of September 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, German forces crossed the Polish border at multiple points simultaneously. The 20 years were over. Everything Warsaw had built and imagined and argued about and loved across those 2 extraordinary decades was about to encounter something that none of it had been designed to survive. Chapter 6. September 1939. The First Destruction. There is a recording that survives from the first morning of the German invasion. It is a radio broadcast from Warsaw, transmitted in the early hours of the 1st of September 1939, when bombs were already falling on Polish cities and the population of the capital was waking to the sound of air raid sirens for the first time. The voice of the broadcaster is professionally calm. Underneath that composure if you listen carefully, is something else. The awareness that the thing they had been dreading and half disbelieving had arrived, and that nothing about what came next was going to be predictable or safe. Warsaw had been preparing. Air raid shelters had been designated in basements across the city. Blackout procedures had been distributed to residents. The city government had made plans for the evacuation of children. Sand had been stacked in public spaces for use against incendiary bombs. These preparations had a quality of terrible reasonableness about them. The rational response of a city that understood what modern aerial bombardment could do and was trying to give its people whatever protection was possible. None of it was adequate. It could not have been. The German air campaign against Warsaw in September of 1939 was not aimed at military targets in any precise sense. It was aimed at the city. Residential neighborhoods were bombed. Hospitals were hit. The historic center took damage that would have been considered catastrophic by the standards of any previous conflict. The Luftwaffe flew bombing missions with a systematic thoroughness designed not merely to damage military capacity, but to break the will of the civilian population. The civilian population of Warsaw did not break. What happened in Warsaw in September of 1939 was one of the first demonstrations of something that would be proven repeatedly across the Second World War. That aerial bombardment of civilian populations tends not to destroy the will to resist, but to harden it. The people of Warsaw, bombed from above and surrounded by German forces, advancing from multiple directions, with a speed that had already overwhelmed the Polish military in the open field, chose to fight. The defense of Warsaw in September of 1939 had no military precedent in its particular character. Regular Polish army units fought with genuine skill and determination. But what made the defense remarkable was the participation of the civilian population, ordinary Warsavians, men and women and teenagers with no military training and no military equipment, dug trenches in the streets with whatever tools they could find. They built barricades from furniture dragged out of apartments and cobblestones pried up from the roads. They formed bucket brigades to fight fires the bombing created. They ran messages and provided medical assistance, and in some cases took up weapons to fight alongside the soldiers defending the city. The mayor of Warsaw, Stefan Starzyński, became the voice of this resistance through his daily radio broadcasts. His addresses to the city during the siege are among the most remarkable documents of civilian courage in the 20th century. He spoke plainly about what was happening and what it required. He did not offer false reassurance about military prospects. He offered something different. The argument that Warsaw's resistance, regardless of its military outcome, was an assertion of the city's identity and dignity that no defeat could erase. The siege lasted 27 days. Food and water became scarce. The bombing continued. Medical supplies ran out. The dead were buried in parks and gardens, and whatever open ground was available, because the cemeteries were full and the roads to them were too dangerous. On the 28th of September 1939, Warsaw surrendered. The terms of the surrender guaranteed the safety of the civilian population. The German military commanders who signed those terms had no intention of honouring them. What entered Warsaw in the days following the surrender was not an occupation force operating under the laws of war. The SS and the Gestapo established themselves within days. Lists of prominent Poles, academics and lawyers and doctors and priests and politicians and military officers, had been prepared in advance. The arrests began immediately. Historical records indicate that Stefan Starzyński was arrested by the Gestapo in late 1939 and taken to a German concentration camp, where he was killed. The precise circumstances and exact date were not officially confirmed for decades after the war. He was 53 years old. The voice that had told Warsaw it was worth defending was silenced before the first winter of the occupation was over. The plan for what Warsaw was to become had been prepared before the invasion. Its author was a German urban planner named Friedrich Pabst, and what he designed for Warsaw was not an occupied Polish city. It was a German city called Neue Deutsche Stadt Warschau, New German City Warsaw. With a population of approximately 130,000 Germans, replacing the 1,300,000 Polish and Jewish inhabitants who currently lived there. The Pabst Plan is one of the most revealing documents of what the Nazi occupation of Poland was actually about. It was about replacement. The Polish people were not to be governed in any permanent sense. They were to be removed, by whatever means proved most efficient. And the physical space they had occupied was to be given to German settlers who would build a German city on the ruins of the Polish one. Those architectural drawings still exist in archives in Germany and Poland. You can look at the Warsaw that was never built, the ghost city the Germans planned to construct on the site of the city they were destroying. Wide German boulevards replacing the irregular medieval streets of the old town. German civic buildings replacing the royal castle, a city designed from scratch on a site to be cleared of everything that had made it Polish. It is one of the strangest documents in the history of urban planning, a detailed professional plan for a city whose construction required the murder of the population currently living there. The murder began in the weeks and months after the occupation was established. Public executions were conducted on the streets of Warsaw as demonstrations of German authority. Random groups of Poles were seized and shot in reprisal for acts of resistance. The universities and secondary schools were closed. Polish cultural institutions were shuttered. The libraries that had survived the bombing were looted, their collections sent to Germany. And yet, in the basements and back rooms and private apartments of Warsaw, in the weeks and months following the occupation, something began to happen that the German occupiers had not planned for because they had not believed it was possible. The city went underground. Underground schools opened, taught by the same teachers who had taught in the legal schools before they were closed, using the same textbooks that had been hidden before the German education authorities could confiscate them. Underground newspapers appeared, printed on whatever equipment could be found and distributed by networks of people who understood that being caught with one meant death. Underground courts operated, applying Polish law to disputes in a city where the official law was German and designed for the benefit of Germans only. Underground theatre, underground concerts, underground university lectures attended by students who understood that learning Polish literature or history in an occupied city where Polish learning was prohibited was a declaration that Poland still existed and intended to continue existing. The infrastructure of Polish underground life in Warsaw between 1939 and 1944 was one of the most complex resistance organizations in occupied Europe. It had its own government, its own military, its own postal system, its own educational institutions, its own courts. It was, in every meaningful sense except the physical control of territory, a functioning state operating inside the shell of a city being systematically destroyed. The people who built and maintained this underground state did so knowing exactly what the penalty was for being discovered. They did it anyway. Tens of thousands of them. Teachers and printers and doctors and lawyers and teenagers and retired military officers and priests who had decided that the alternative to resistance was a form of death that happened before the body stopped breathing. The Pabst Plan called for a German city of 130,000 on this ground. The people who were supposed to disappear to make room for it were, in their basements and their back rooms, running a country. The German administration had badly underestimated what it was dealing with. It would continue to underestimate it, at increasing cost to itself, for the next 5 years. Chapter 7. The Ghetto, a city inside a city. On a street in the Wola district of Warsaw, set into the pavement at the edge of the sidewalk, there is a small brass marker. It is easy to miss. Tourists walk past it without noticing. Even Varsovians who have lived in the neighborhood for years sometimes do not know it is there. The marker indicates the line of a wall, not a wall that stands now. A wall that was built in 1940, stood for 3 years, and was demolished in 1943, along with most of what it had enclosed. The wall of the Warsaw Ghetto ran for 18 kilometers through the northern districts of the city. It stood 3 meters high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. The labor of building it was performed by Jewish workers. The cost of building it was charged to the Jewish community. The German administration's talent for making the victims pay for the instruments of their own destruction was applied here with the matter-of-fact thoroughness that characterized everything the occupation did. The decision to create a sealed Jewish ghetto in Warsaw was made by the German occupation authorities in the autumn of 1940. The process of concentrating the city's Jewish population into a defined area had been building through the preceding months. Through a series of restrictions and regulations and relocations that were clearly moving in a specific direction, even when the final destination had not yet been officially announced. By October of 1940, the destination was announced. A section of Warsaw's northern districts, covering approximately 3.5 square kilometers, was designated as the Jewish Residential District. All Jewish residents were required to move into it. All non-Jewish residents currently living there were required to move out. By the time the ghetto was sealed in November of 1940, it contained somewhere between 350,000 and 400,000 people within its 3.5 square kilometers. The density is difficult to hold in the mind. In a city block that might normally house 200 or 300 people, there were now thousands. Apartments designed for single families held multiple families in each room. The infrastructure of water and sewage and heating, never designed for anything approaching this density, was immediately and permanently overwhelmed. Food was rationed by the German administration according to a scale that was explicitly designed to produce starvation. The official ration for Jewish residents was set at approximately 180 calories per day. The daily caloric requirement for an adult engaged in physical labor is around 2,500 to 3,000 calories. The gap between what the German administration officially permitted the ghetto population to eat and what human beings require to survive was not an oversight or a miscalculation. It was a policy. The people of the Warsaw Ghetto responded with the same instinct for organized survival that the wider Polish underground had demonstrated. Smuggling became the primary means of keeping the population alive. Children, small enough to slip through gaps in the wall or bribe guards with whatever could be scraped together, became the main conduit for food coming in from the Polish side. The risks were explicit and immediate. German guards had standing orders to shoot smugglers. Children caught smuggling were shot. This did not stop the smuggling because stopping it meant accepting starvation, and the people of the ghetto had not yet accepted that. Inside the ghetto, institutions appeared with a speed and sophistication that astonished even those who created them. Schools operated, officially prohibited, but running in private apartments with teachers who understood that educating children was one of the few acts of normality available. Hospitals functioned under conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty, with doctors treating patients for diseases caused by starvation and overcrowding using supplies obtained through the same smuggling networks that brought food. A symphony orchestra gave concerts. Writers continued writing, and one historian kept records. Emanuel Ringelblum organized a secret archive inside the ghetto called Oyneg Shabes. which means the joy of the Sabbath. Dozens of writers and scholars and ordinary residents documented life in the ghetto with a systematic thoroughness that was explicitly intended to create a historical record for people who came after. Ringelblum and his colleagues understood something that gives the archive its particular quality of moral weight. They understood that they might not survive to see the record used. They created it anyway. They buried the documents in metal containers and milk cans beneath the ghetto buildings against the day when someone would dig them up. 2 of the 3 caches were recovered after the war. The third has never been found. It may still be there, under the apartment buildings of post-war Warsaw, waiting. The Oyneg Shabes documents, now held in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, are among the most important historical records of the 20th century. The accounts of hunger and fear are there. So are the accounts of the concerts and the theatre performances and the debates among political factions that continued even as the population was dying around them. The full range of human response to an inhuman situation, recorded by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The ghetto was dying from the moment it was sealed. The death rate from starvation and disease in the first 2 years was catastrophic. Bodies were collected from the streets every morning. Then, in the summer of 1942, the pace of death accelerated beyond anything the ghetto had experienced. In July of 1942, the German SS initiated the operation given the bureaucratic name Aktion Reinhard. Its purpose was the murder of the Jewish population of the German-administered territory of occupied Poland. The instrument was a network of extermination camps, purpose-built facilities designed to kill human beings at industrial scale. The nearest to Warsaw was Treblinka, approximately 80 kilometers northeast of the city. Beginning on the 22nd of July 1942, trains began leaving the Warsaw Ghetto for Treblinka. The German administration told the Jewish Council that the population was being resettled in the east for labor purposes. Within days, it was not possible to believe anymore. Information came back through various channels about what was happening at the end of the railway line. The trains were not going to labor camps. They were going to a killing facility. The people on them were being murdered on arrival. The deportations continued for 52 days. Approximately 300,000 people were taken from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka in those 52 days. 52 days. By September of 1942, when the main deportation action was suspended, the ghetto, that had held 350,000 to 400,000 people in November of 1940, held somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000. The streets that had been almost impassable from human density were now largely empty. The buildings that had held dozens of families held a few. The infrastructure of a community, the schools and hospitals and the orchestra and the archive, had been reduced to fragments maintained by whoever remained. Those who remained knew they were not safe. They had watched 300,000 of their community taken away and murdered. The question that the remaining population faced in the autumn and winter of 1942 was not whether they could survive. Most understood they probably could not. The question was whether they could choose the terms of their death. The answer was organized through the winter of 1942 to 1943. Two main resistance organizations, the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union, set aside years of political disagreement and began acquiring weapons smuggled in from the Polish underground outside the ghetto. Bunkers were constructed in the basements of ghetto buildings, connected by tunnels, stocked with food and water and whatever ammunition could be obtained. On the 19th of April, 1943, the eve of Passover, German SS and police forces entered the ghetto to complete the deportation of the remaining population. they were met with fire. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted 27 days. The fighters, numbering somewhere between 750 and 1,000, faced German forces with armoured vehicles and artillery and air support. They knew from the beginning that military victory was not possible. They were not fighting to win in any conventional military sense. They were fighting to choose, to refuse the role of passive victim, to make the Germans pay a price, however small, for what was being done, to demonstrate, for whoever survived to see the record, that the Jewish community of Warsaw had not gone to its death without resistance. Mordecai Anielewicz, the 24-year-old commander of the Jewish Combat Organization, wrote a letter during the uprising that has become one of the defining documents of Jewish resistance in the 20th century. He described the situation with clarity and without self-pity. He expressed something that reads, "Across the decades," as close to satisfaction, not pleasure, not triumph, the specific satisfaction of someone who has done what they decided to do regardless of the cost. According to most historical accounts, he died in the bunker at Mila 18 on or around the 8th of May, 1943, along with most of the surviving fighters. When German forces pumped poison gas into the tunnel system, the German SS commander Jürgen Stroop submitted a formal report to his superiors when the uprising was suppressed, titled, "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw is No More." It is one of the most chilling documents of the war, not because of its content, but because of its tone. Stroop wrote about the destruction of a community of human beings with the satisfied precision of a professional describing a successfully completed project. He was tried and hanged in Warsaw in 1952. Heinrich Himmler, who received Stroop's report, ordered the complete demolition of the ghetto. German demolition units moved through the ruins systematically, blowing up or burning whatever structures still stood. The ghetto that had held 400,000 people was to be reduced to an empty field. Stand in that part of Warsaw today. The streets are lined with post-war apartment buildings built in the 1950s and 1960s on the cleared ground of the demolished ghetto. The Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews stands there now, its copper-clad exterior designed to suggest the parting of the Red Sea, a building of genuine architectural power sitting on ground that holds the remnants of the world it documents. Walk to the monument at Mila 18, a small mound of earth and rubble that was left deliberately uncleared after the war, marking the site of the bunker where Anielewicz and his comrades died. It is a modest monument by the standards of what it commemorates, but the modesty is appropriate. The people it honors were not trying to be monumental. They were trying to be human in conditions designed to make that impossible. The brass markers in the pavement that trace the line of the ghetto wall run through the modern city for stretches of several blocks, then disappear under buildings, then reappear on the other side. Most people walk past without noticing. They are walking through the outline of the largest Jewish community that ever existed in Europe, on ground where 400,000 people once lived, and where most of them were murdered during the Holocaust. Chapter 8. The Uprising 63 Days. There is a clock in Warsaw that counts time in a particular way. It stands near the monument to the Warsaw Uprising in the center of the city, and it marks not hours and minutes, but a duration. 63 days. The length of the longest and bloodiest urban uprising of the Second World War. The length of time the people of Warsaw held their city against the German army while the world watched and calculated and largely did nothing. To understand what happened in Warsaw in the summer and autumn of 1944, you have to understand the situation that made the uprising seem, to the people who launched it, not merely possible but necessary. By the summer of 1944, the German military position on the Eastern Front had been collapsing for over a year. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943 had ended the German strategic offensive and begun the long Soviet counteroffensive pushing the German armies westward. By July of 1944, the Red Army had broken through German lines in Belarus in an operation called Bagration, one of the most decisive military victories of the entire war. Soviet forces were advancing westward at a pace that seemed to promise the liberation of Warsaw within weeks. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, was the military arm of the Polish government in exile based in London. It was the largest underground resistance organization in occupied Europe, with somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 members across the Polish territories. Its Warsaw command, under General Tadeusz Komorowski, had been planning an uprising in the capital for years, waiting for the moment when German weakness and Allied proximity would make a successful military operation possible. That moment appeared to have arrived in late July of 1944. Soviet radio broadcasts were calling on the people of Warsaw to rise against the German occupiers. The sounds of artillery could be heard on the eastern outskirts of the city. Soviet tanks had reached the suburb of Praga on the eastern bank of the Vistula. To the Polish Home Army Command, the strategic logic seemed clear. If Polish forces liberated Warsaw before the Soviets arrived, the Polish government in exile would have a legitimate claim to authority in the capital. If the Soviets liberated Warsaw without a Polish rising, the communist-backed Polish committee that Stalin had established as an alternative government would have the military and political backing to take control of the country. The uprising was not only a military operation, it was a political declaration. It was Warsaw saying, as loudly and clearly as a city can say anything, that Poland intended to determine its own future. At 5 p.m. on the 1st of August 1944, at the hour that the Home Army called the W hour, approximately 40,000 fighters across Warsaw attacked German positions simultaneously. The first hours were chaotic in the way that the opening of any large urban military operation is chaotic. Units hit their objectives at different times and with different results. Communications broke down. Plans collided with the reality of German defensive positions that were stronger in some places and weaker in others than the intelligence had suggested. But in many parts of the city, the initial attacks succeeded. German units were surprised. Positions were captured. The red and white flag of Poland went up over buildings that had flown the German swastika for 5 years. In the streets below those flags, the civilian population of Warsaw emerged from the cautious semi-invisibility that 5 years of occupation had imposed on them, and did something that several witnesses later described with the same quality of astonishment. They celebrated, not because the war was over, they knew the war was not over, but because for the first time in 5 years they were visible, publicly and collectively Polish, in their own city, without the immediate threat of a German reprisal for the act of being themselves. That feeling lasted, in its full intensity, perhaps a week. The German response was organized with a speed and ferocity that reflected both the military experience of the forces involved and the specific orders that had come from Hitler himself. Warsaw was to be destroyed, not pacified, not controlled, destroyed. The civilian population was to be killed. The buildings were to be demolished. The city that had refused to be German was to be made into something that could not be anything at all. The units sent to carry out these orders were among the most brutal the German military and SS had available. The Deluge Brigade, a formation composed largely of convicted criminals released from prison to serve in the SS, was sent into the Wola district in the first days of August. What they did there in the first week of the uprising is known in Polish history as the Wola Massacre. and it stands as one of the worst atrocities committed against a civilian population in Western Europe during the entire war. In the streets and apartments and courtyards and hospitals of Wola, German and collaborator forces systematically killed the civilian population: men, women, children, patients in hospitals, staff treating them. The killing was not incidental to military operations. It was the military operation. Estimates of the number of civilians killed in Wola in the first week of August range from 40,000 to 60,000 people in 5 to 7 days. In one district of one city, the 63 days that followed were not a continuous military campaign in any organized sense. They were a grinding street by street, building by building, struggle for survival in a city being systematically demolished around the people fighting in it. Underground passages and sewers became the primary means of moving between areas that German forces had cut off from each other. Fighters moved through the sewers for hours at a time, in darkness and filth, carrying ammunition and messages and wounded comrades, navigating by memory and by the sound of German positions above their heads. The children of Warsaw became couriers, teenage girls and boys, small enough to move through spaces adults could not use, carried messages between home army units and medical supplies to improvised hospitals and food to positions that had no other means of resupply. They were called Małe Powstańcy, the little insurgents. They wore armbands. They knew the passwords. They ran through streets under fire because someone had to, and they could move faster than adults through the rubble. Some of them were 10 years old. Some of them did not survive. The Allied response to the Warsaw Uprising was one of the most painful episodes in the diplomatic history of the Second World War. The Polish government in exile in London appealed repeatedly for airdrops of supplies to the fighting city. The logistics were genuinely difficult. Warsaw was at the extreme range of aircraft operating from bases in Britain and Italy. But the logistical difficulties were compounded by political ones. Stalin refused to allow Allied aircraft to land at Soviet air bases after dropping supplies over Warsaw, a refusal that made the supply operation vastly more difficult. The Soviet position, which Stalin maintained with a consistency that eliminated any possibility of misunderstanding his intentions, was that the uprising was a reckless adventure by reactionary elements and that the Soviet Union had no obligation to support it. The Red Army stopped on the eastern bank of the Vistula. The question of why the Soviet forces stopped, whether it was a deliberate political decision to allow the Home Army to be destroyed before Soviet forces entered the city, or a genuine military necessity imposed by the exhaustion of the Bagration offensive and the difficulty of crossing a major river against defended positions, has been debated by historians for 8 decades. The evidence does not support a simple answer. What is not in dispute is the result. The uprising fought and died on the western bank of the Vistula, while Soviet forces sat on the eastern bank. By September, the military situation was clearly hopeless. The Germans had retaken most of the city. The areas still held by the Home Army were contracting. The civilian population, which had been surviving on minimal food for 2 months, was near the limits of physical endurance. On the 2nd of October, 1944, General Komorowski signed the surrender agreement. The terms guaranteed the rights of Home Army fighters as prisoners of war. The civilian population was to be evacuated rather than killed. Between 150,000 and 200,000 people had died in Warsaw between the 1st of August and the 2nd of October, 1944. The majority of them were civilians. The city that had spent 20 extraordinary interwar years becoming itself had been fighting for its survival for 63 days and had lost. What happened next was the part of Warsaw's story that has no real parallel in modern history. Hitler's order to demolish Warsaw was not a figure of speech. It was an operational directive, and the German military carried it out with the systematic thoroughness they applied to everything. Specialized demolition units moved into the emptied city in October and November of 1944. They were called Verbrennungs- und Vernichtungskommandos, burning and destruction commandos. They moved through the streets of Warsaw building by building, street by street, setting fires and placing demolition charges and reducing to rubble every structure they encountered. The royal castle was blown up, not damaged, not burned, systematically demolished, with charges placed by engineers who understood how to bring large masonry structures down efficiently. The facades, the interior rooms, the Great Hall, where the Constitution of the 3rd of May had been proclaimed in 1791. All of it came down. The Cathedral of St. John in the Old Town was demolished. The palace complexes along the royal route were burned and blown up. The historic merchant houses of the market square were destroyed. Libraries and museums and churches and hospitals and ordinary apartment buildings, everything received the same treatment. By the time the demolition units had finished, they had destroyed approximately 85% of the structures in Warsaw. Some Poles who had not been evacuated hid in the ruins during the demolition. They lived in basements and cellars and underground spaces beneath demolished buildings, surviving on whatever they could find in the wreckage, moving at night to avoid the demolition units. They were witnesses to something no one had been intended to survive to describe: the deliberate, methodical, professional destruction of one of Europe's great cities, carried out not in the heat of military action, but in cold administrative implementation of a written order. In January of 1945, the Red Army finally crossed the Vistula and advanced through what remained of Warsaw. There was almost no fighting. There was almost nothing left to fight over. Chapter 9. The Rubble, Warsaw, in January 1945. On the 17th of January 1945, Soviet forces entered what remained of Warsaw. The soldiers who moved through the city that morning were experienced men who had spent years on the Eastern Front and had seen the destruction that industrial-scale war could produce across thousands of kilometers of European territory. By 1945, they were not easily shocked. Warsaw shocked them. The images that Soviet photographers and cameramen documented in those first days have a quality that sets them apart from other wartime photography. They are not dramatic in the way that combat photography is dramatic. They are quiet. There are no bodies in most of the photographs. There is no fire. There is no movement of any kind. There is only the stillness of a city that has been unmade, block after block after block, in every direction, as far as the lens can reach. The buildings are not damaged. They are gone. What remains are occasional facades, standing without floors or roofs behind them, and rubble, and snow covering the rubble, and silence. One kind of destruction comes from war. What the cameras recorded in Warsaw in January of 1945 came from something else, from a decision made at a desk by men who were still alive when the fighting stopped, and who had used that time to send specialists with demolition charges and written orders to finish what the bombs had started. Now consider what that silence actually represented in numbers. Before the war, Warsaw had a population of approximately 1,300,000 people. In January of 1945, as few as 1,000 people remained in the ruins of the city. Not 1,000 per neighborhood, perhaps 1,000 in total. In a city that had held more than 1 million, the others were dead, or in prisoner of war camps in Germany, or in forced labor camps, or scattered across the Polish countryside and the refugee camps of Europe. 85% of the city's structures had been destroyed. The streets were impassable in many places because the rubble of the buildings on either side had collapsed into them. The sewer system was shattered. The water system was shattered. The electrical system did not exist. The temperature in Warsaw in January of 1945 was well below zero. There was no fuel. There was no food supply network. There was nothing that a modern city requires to function, and almost nothing that human beings require to survive in a Polish winter. And yet the question that the new provisional government faced in those first weeks was not only how to rebuild a city, it was whether to rebuild this one. The rational answer, the one that urban planners and economists and practical administrators were expected to give, was that Warsaw should not be rebuilt. The destruction was too complete. The cost would be astronomical. Other Polish cities had survived the war with their infrastructure largely intact. Kraków was largely undamaged. Łódź was functioning. Poznan had suffered damage but remained a city in any recognizable sense. The rational thing to do was to declare Warsaw a ruin and build the new capital of the new Poland somewhere that already had buildings. This argument was made. It was seriously considered. It lost. It lost for reasons that were partly political, partly emotional, and partly rooted in something about Warsaw and its relationship to Polish identity that resists translation into the language of rational cost-benefit analysis. Warsaw was the capital. It had been the capital for 3.5 centuries. The royal castle was there, or rather the rubble of it was there, and the idea of a Poland that chose not to rebuild its royal castle when it had the chance was simply not a Poland that most Poles recognized. There was also the matter of what the Germans had intended. The deliberate demolition of Warsaw had been ordered precisely because the Germans understood that a city is not merely an accumulation of structures, but the physical embodiment of a culture's memory and identity. If Warsaw could be reduced to rubble, Polish culture had nowhere to be itself in the most concentrated and visible way. The decision to rebuild Warsaw was therefore not only a practical decision about urban reconstruction, it was a refusal to accept the German intention. It was a declaration that the intention had failed. The provisional government announced in February of 1945 that Warsaw would be rebuilt and would remain the capital of Poland. The people who had been evacuated from Warsaw in October of 1944 began coming back before the announcement was made. They came back through the winter, on foot and on overcrowded trains and on anything else that moved, into a city that had no water and no heat and no electricity and was covered in rubble and snow, because Warsaw was their city and they had nowhere else that was theirs in the same way. By the end of 1945, approximately 300,000 people were living in what remained of Warsaw, in basements and improvised shelters and the occasional building that had survived the demolition, in a city that could not adequately feed or heat or supply them. They were already clearing rubble, by hand, with whatever tools were available, beginning the work that everyone understood would take decades, and that no one was willing to wait for someone else to start. The German demolition units had not understood what they were dealing with. They had destroyed 85% of the buildings of Warsaw. They had not destroyed the reason Warsaw mattered, or the people who intended to put it back together, or the memory that would serve as the blueprint. That memory, it turned out, was more durable than any building they had blown up. Chapter 10. The Reconstruction Memory as Blueprint. There is a painting by Bernardo Bellotto that hangs in the Royal Castle in Warsaw. It shows the Old Town Market Square in the 1770s, viewed from the south, with the merchant houses of the square arranged in careful perspective, their painted facades and roof lines and window proportions rendered with the kind of precise architectural detail that distinguishes a painter who understood buildings from one who merely depicted them. The light in the painting is the particular golden light of a northern European summer afternoon, falling on cobblestones and facades, and the figures of Varsovians going about their ordinary business in a city that was, at the moment Bellotto captured it, at the height of its Enlightenment confidence. Bellotto came to Warsaw in 1767 at the invitation of King Stanisław August, and spent years painting the city with a thoroughness and accuracy that was, at the time, simply the work of a court painter doing his job. He could not have known that he was creating the blueprints for the reconstruction of a city that would not be destroyed for another 170 years. When the architects and urban planners of post-war Warsaw began the work of reconstructing the old town in the late 1940s, they confronted a problem that had no precedent in the history of urban reconstruction. They were not rebuilding a city that had been damaged. They were rebuilding a city that had been deliberately and professionally demolished to the greatest extent that 20th century engineering could achieve. The buildings whose facades were to be recreated existed only in rubble, and in the memories of the people who had lived among them, and in whatever documentary record had survived the occupation. The documentary record was less complete than it might have been, but more complete than it had any right to be. Polish museum workers and archivists, understanding from the first days of the occupation what was being planned for their city, had spent 5 years secretly copying architectural drawings, photographing building facades, removing historical artifacts to protected storage, and creating the kind of systematic documentation that they hoped would survive to be useful. Some of that documentation had survived, enough to work from, and then there were the Bellotto paintings. Bellotto had painted Warsaw with the precision of an architect rather than the impressionism of a landscape painter. His canvases recorded the exact dimensions of window openings, the specific profiles of decorative cornices, the precise relationships between building heights and street widths, the colours of facades and the patterns of roof tiles. Architectural historians examining his Warsaw paintings after the war concluded that they were accurate enough to serve as working documents for reconstruction. Not approximate guides, actual blueprints. The reconstruction architects measured the Bellotto canvases. They extrapolated dimensions from the painted perspective. They used the paintings to resolve disputes about what specific building elements had looked like when other documentary evidence was contradictory or absent. They did what no architectural team in history had ever done before. They used 18th century oil paintings as the primary source for a 20th century construction project. The work began in the rubble and the cold of 1945 and 1946 with a labour force that had no precedent either. Professional architects and construction workers were there, but so were university students, school children, soldiers of the Polish army, women who had no construction experience but were willing to learn it, retired teachers, shopkeepers, anyone who could carry brick or mix mortar or swing a hammer. The rebuilding of Warsaw was not a professional construction project in any normal sense. It was a national act, participated in by whoever was physically present and willing. The rubble itself became the first resource. The bricks of destroyed Warsaw were recovered from the demolition debris by hand, cleaned individually with small hammers to remove the old mortar, sorted by size and type, and stacked in organized piles that would supply the reconstruction. The work of cleaning bricks was done largely by women, and the image of Warsaw women cleaning bricks in the rubble of their destroyed city became one of the defining images of the reconstruction period. There is something almost extraordinary about this detail. The same bricks that the German demolition units had reduced to rubble by blowing up the buildings around them were being cleaned and sorted and prepared to become those buildings again. The physical material of Warsaw's destruction was being converted by the labour of Warsaw's survivors into the material of its reconstruction. Nothing was imported that could be found in the debris. Nothing was discarded that could be reused. The city was being rebuilt from its own ruins. The architectural decisions made during the reconstruction were not simple or uncontested. There were architects who argued that the old town should be reconstructed exactly as it had appeared before the war. There were others who argued that exact reproduction was impossible without complete documentation, and that attempts at it would produce a pastiche rather than an authentic restoration. There were modernists who argued that the opportunity of reconstruction should be used to create a new Warsaw rather than recreating the old one, that building a 20th century city on a medieval street plan was a category error. The argument was resolved, in practice, by the people of Warsaw themselves. The popular attachment to the old town, to the specific streets and specific squares and specific buildings that Warsavians had lived among and loved and been separated from by force, was not an abstraction to be resolved by urban planning theory. It was a political and emotional reality that the reconstruction had to accommodate. The answer the reconstruction architects arrived at was both pragmatic and philosophically interesting. The facades of the old town buildings would be reconstructed as accurately as the available documentation permitted, using the Bellotto paintings and the surviving architectural drawings and the memories of the people who had lived there. The interiors would be rebuilt to modern standards. The street plan of the old town would be followed exactly, but certain changes that had accumulated over the centuries, later additions and modifications that had obscured earlier forms, would be omitted from the reconstruction, effectively returning some buildings to earlier historical states. The reconstruction was not, in other words, a perfect reproduction of Warsaw as it had existed in September of 1939. It was Warsaw as remembered and interpreted, and in some cases improved by the people rebuilding it. It was memory made physical, which is, if you think about it carefully, what all historical cities actually are. The difference in Warsaw was that the process was conscious and compressed into a decade rather than extended across centuries. The most controversial architectural decision of the Reconstruction period was not the old town. It was what rose in the centre of the cleared city in the early 1950s. The Palace of Culture and Science, completed in 1955, was described as a gift from the Soviet Union to the Polish people. It was paid for by the Soviet Union rather than by Poland, and it was not something the Polish people had asked for or wanted. It was a statement, expressed in approximately 237 meters of Stalinist Gothic architecture rising from the centre of Warsaw, of the relationship between Poland and the Soviet Union at the height of the Stalinist period. Warsavians have had a complicated relationship with the Palace of Culture ever since it was built. It dominates the Warsaw skyline from every direction. Jokes about it have been a staple of Warsaw humour for 7 decades. The most frequently repeated one holds that the best view in Warsaw is from the top of the Palace of Culture, because that is the only place in the city from which you cannot see it. The old town market square was completed and opened to the public in the early 1950s. Standing in it for the first time after the reconstruction was complete, Warsavians who remembered what had stood there before described an experience that was simultaneously strange and deeply familiar. The proportions were right. The facades were right. The cobblestones underfoot were new, but laid in the pattern of the old ones. The space felt like the space they had known, in a way that no amount of historical knowledge about the fact of reconstruction could entirely undermine. In 1980, UNESCO added the historic centre of Warsaw to the World Heritage List. The designation was unusual and in some respects unprecedented. World Heritage status is normally granted to places of outstanding historical or cultural value that have survived from the past. The historic centre of Warsaw had not survived from the past. It was a reconstruction, less than 40 years old at the time of designation, built by 20th century workers on the basis of 18th century paintings and fragmented archival documentation. UNESCO designated it anyway. The reason was not that the historic centre was an outstanding example of historical architecture. It was that the reconstruction of the historic centre was itself an outstanding example of human achievement. What the people of Warsaw had done, deciding to rebuild their destroyed city from its ruins and then actually doing it, was declared to be of universal value, not because of what was built, but because of what the act of building it demonstrated about human commitment to memory and culture, and the refusal to accept destruction as permanent. No committee of heritage experts had ever been asked to make that argument before. It was the right argument to make. Chapter 11. The Iron Curtain City. Start with a specific evening in Warsaw in December of 1981. A man is walking home from a friend's apartment at 10 o'clock at night. The streets are quiet in a way that Warsaw streets are not normally quiet at 10 o'clock on a weekday. The quiet has a quality that the man, who is a printer by trade and has lived in this city his entire life, recognizes immediately as the quiet of something wrong rather than the quiet of something peaceful. He turns a corner and sees, parked at the end of the street in the darkness, a military vehicle, and then another, and then, at the intersection beyond it, the unmistakable silhouette of a tank. Martial law was declared in Poland on the 13th of December 1981. The announcement came at 6 in the morning, read by General Wojciech Jaruzelski, in military uniform on state television. By then, the tanks were already in position on the streets of Warsaw and every other major Polish city. The leaders of Solidarity had been arrested during the night. The borders were closed. The telephone network had been cut. For that printer walking home on the night of December 12th, the tank at the end of his street was the physical embodiment of something he had lived with his entire life but had, in the preceding 16 months of Solidarity's existence, briefly been allowed to believe might be ending. The sense that the space between what was officially permitted and what was actually desired was not a space that the state was going to allow to grow indefinitely. To understand that moment, and why it was not the end of the story but only the most dramatic pause in it, you have to understand what Warsaw under communism had actually been like across the 36 years that preceded it. Warsaw under communism was two cities at once. The first was the city that official culture produced and official photography documented. Wide boulevards and monumental public buildings and workers, housing developments stretching across the former rubble fields of the wartime city. The basic apparatus of urban civilization, rebuilt in a city that had had none of it in January of 1945. Trams ran, schools opened, hospitals functioned. The infrastructure of a modern capital was restored, and this was real, whatever the political system that rebuilt it. The rebuilding was real, and the people who had been living in ruins genuinely needed it. The second Warsaw existed in the spaces the official city could not fully reach. The kitchen table where things were said that could not be said in public. The Catholic Church, which maintained a degree of institutional independence from the communist state that was unique in the Soviet bloc, and that gave Poles a space to be publicly themselves in ways that required no performance of loyalty to a system many of them regarded as imposed rather than chosen. The underground publications, the samizdat literature printed on primitive equipment in someone's apartment and passed from hand to hand, because the information the official press would not print still needed to circulate somehow. And the jazz. The Warsaw Jazz Festival began in 1956. In the brief thaw that followed Stalin's death, jazz, which the Soviet cultural establishment denounced as decadent American noise, was in Poland tolerated with an inconsistency that reflected the particular character of Polish communism and the particular stubbornness of Polish culture in insisting on things the system found inconvenient. Polish musicians who had been playing American jazz in underground clubs for years moved into larger venues. International musicians began coming to Warsaw for the festival. What had been forbidden in the basements was now happening on a stage, in a communist capital, and the audiences understood perfectly well what they were participating in. Not just music, a small, specific, publicly enacted refusal. The festival still runs today. It is one of the oldest and most respected jazz events in Europe. It began as an act of cultural stubbornness and became a tradition. The cultural vitality of Warsaw under communism was one of the genuine paradoxes of the period. A system that was, in many respects, intellectually suffocating and economically incompetent produced, in Poland, a culture of remarkable creativity. Polish cinema of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was internationally recognized as among the most significant in the world. Directors including Andrzej Wajda and Krzysztof Kieślowski made films that engaged with Polish history and Polish moral experience with a depth and seriousness that found audiences in Poland and abroad despite the cultural bureaucracy trying to constrain them. Wajda's film Kano, released in 1957, told the story of Home Army fighters during the Warsaw Uprising moving through the sewers of the city in the final days of the insurrection. It was the first significant cinematic treatment of the Warsaw Uprising in post-war Polish culture, a subject the communist government had been suppressing because the Home Army had fought for the London government in exile rather than the Soviet-backed administration. The film could not be fully explicit about the political circumstances, but Warsaw audiences in 1957 understood exactly what they were watching. They were watching their own story being told for the first time in public. The cinema was not large enough for everyone who wanted to see it. The 1960s brought a different quality of tension. In 1968, student protests in Warsaw were met with a violent government response and an official anti-Semitic campaign that drove most of what remained of Warsaw's small post-war Jewish community to emigrate. The Jewish community that had survived the war in Poland, already reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size, numbered perhaps 15,000 people by 1968. The campaign of that year, organized from within the Communist Party and using state media to portray Jewish Poles as politically suspect, drove most of the remaining community to leave. Warsaw, the city that had been home to the largest urban Jewish community in the world before the war, was effectively emptied of its remaining Jewish residents by the government that had inherited the ruins of that community. The 1970s brought economic crisis. The command economy was showing the structural weaknesses that would eventually destroy it. Queuing for basic goods became a permanent feature of Warsaw daily life. The borrowed money that the government had used to briefly raise living standards ran out. By the end of the decade, Poland owed Western creditors more than it could realistically repay. Then, in October of 1978, news arrived that electrified Poland in a way that nothing had since the end of the war. The College of Cardinals in Rome had elected a new pope. He was Polish. His name was Karol Wojtyła, and he had been the Archbishop of Kraków. A Polish pope was not only a religious event, it was a declaration that the culture the Church had preserved through partition and occupation and communist suppression was recognized at the highest level of one of the world's major institutions. When John Paul II visited Poland in June of 1979, the first visit of a reigning pope to a communist country, The crowds that gathered across Poland were not only expressing religious devotion, they were expressing something about who they were and what they belonged to that the communist state had been unable to suppress or replace in 35 years of trying. The visit produced a shift in what Poles believed was possible. Not immediately, not overnight, but the awareness that the gap between the party and the people was visible to the whole world, and that the whole world was watching, changed the calculation for everyone involved. The strikes that began in the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk in August of 1980 produced, within weeks, the founding of the Solidarity trade union movement, the first independent trade union in the Soviet bloc. By the end of 1980, Solidarity had approximately 10 million members, roughly a quarter of Poland's entire population. It had its own press. It was, in practice, an alternative to the communist state rather than an organization within it. And then, on the 13th of December, 1981, the tanks appeared on the streets. That printer, walking home and seeing the tank at the end of his street, went home. He did not run toward it. He did not immediately organize resistance. He went home because there was nothing else to do right then, and because going home was not the same as giving up, and because he understood, in the way that people who have been doing this for generations understand it, that the system that had just put tanks on his street had not succeeded in killing the thing the tanks were supposed to suppress. Martial law lasted formally until 1983. The restrictions it imposed continued in various forms afterward. Underground Solidarity continued to function, publishing newspapers and organizing networks and maintaining the institutional memory of the movement that martial law had driven underground but not destroyed. Both sides understood by the late 1980s that the situation was not sustainable. The Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was signaling that it would not intervene militarily to maintain communist governments in the bloc. The economy was failing. The population's tolerance for the gap between official claims and daily reality had reached its limit. In February of 1989, the Polish Communist government and the Solidarity opposition sat down together at a large round table in Warsaw and began negotiating the terms of a political transition that both sides understood was going to end communist rule in Poland. The Round Table Agreements, signed in April of 1989, provided for partially free elections in June. The results of those elections were unambiguous. Solidarity won every contested seat it was permitted to contest. The Communist Party candidates, even those running unopposed, failed to receive the required majority of votes because voters crossed their names off the ballot rather than affirm them. On the 24th of August, 1989, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a Catholic intellectual and Solidarity advisor, became the first non-communist Prime Minister of Poland since the late 1940s. He gave his acceptance speech in Warsaw. Those who lived through that night in December of 1981, the night of the tanks, described afterward what they felt when they heard that speech. Not triumph, something quieter and more durable than triumph. The feeling of something that had been pressed down for a very long time being allowed, finally, to straighten up. Chapter 12. 1989 and the Second Reinvention. There is a photograph taken in Warsaw in the summer of 1989 that captures something about the moment better than any written description can. It shows a billboard on one of the central streets of the city. The billboard had been used for years to display communist propaganda, the kind of official messaging that covered public surfaces across the Soviet bloc with images of workers and slogans about collective progress and the achievements of the socialist state. Someone had replaced the propaganda with an advertisement. something ordinary and commercial and completely banal by the standards of any Western European city. In Warsaw, in the summer of 1989, it was not banal at all. It was a declaration. The billboards of the city were no longer telling people what the party wanted them to think. They were selling them things they might actually want to buy. The distinction between those two functions, small as it might seem from the outside, was enormous to the people who had been living under the first version for 40 years. The transition that Poland made between 1989 and the mid-1990s was one of the most rapid and comprehensive political and economic transformations that any country had ever attempted. The communist command economy was dismantled and replaced with market mechanisms at a pace that produced genuine economic growth over the medium term and genuine suffering over the short term. State enterprises that had employed thousands of workers were privatized or closed. The social safety net contracted sharply as government budgets were cut. Warsaw in the early 1990s was a city of contradictions visible on the same street at the same moment. New private businesses opened in spaces that had housed state enterprises. Street markets appeared everywhere, selling goods that had been unavailable for decades. Young Varsovians with access to Western capital or Western education were building businesses with a speed and confidence that reflected 40 years of suppressed entrepreneurial energy, finally finding its outlet. At the same time, pensioners who had spent their working lives in the communist system found that their savings had been destroyed by inflation, and that the state on whose promises they had organized their lives was no longer able to keep those promises. The physical transformation of Warsaw in the 1990s was as dramatic as anything the Reconstruction of the 1940s and 50s had produced, but driven by different forces and producing a different kind of city, capital, suddenly available and suddenly legal, flowed into Warsaw's commercial real estate with a speed that changed the skyline faster than any planned reconstruction could have done. Office towers rose in the center of the city around the Palace of Culture, eventually surrounding it with buildings that competed with it for height. The area around the central railway station became the commercial heart of a new Warsaw, filled with the glass and steel towers of international banks and law firms and consulting companies that had arrived to participate in the transformation of the Polish economy. The contrast between the reconstructed old town and the new commercial centre became one of the defining visual characteristics of Warsaw, a city that contained within itself both a meticulous recreation of a 17th century market town and a skyline that would not look out of place in Frankfurt or Amsterdam. The two coexisted in a way that was slightly surreal and entirely Warsaw, a city that had always been required to hold contradictions that other places did not have to manage. The Warsaw Uprising Museum, which opened on the 1st of August 2004, exactly 60 years after the beginning of the uprising, was the most significant cultural institution created in post-communist Warsaw. The museum told the full story of what had happened in the summer and autumn of 1944, not the version the communist government had found acceptable, the full version, including the political context, including the Soviet decision to halt on the Eastern Bank, including the abandonment by the Western Allies, including the 63 days in their full human specificity. The museum was an immediate success by every measure. Attendance exceeded projections from the first weeks. School groups came from across Poland. International visitors, who had known nothing about the Warsaw Uprising before visiting, left with an understanding of an event that shaped modern Poland as fundamentally as any other in the 20th century. It was a declaration about memory. The city that had been forbidden for 40 years to officially commemorate its own uprising had built a museum that did exactly that, with the quality and ambition the subject deserved. The Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. which opened its core exhibition in 2014 on the site of the former Warsaw Ghetto, was the second great commemorative institution of post-communist Warsaw. The name Polin is the Hebrew word for Poland, deriving from a legend about the arrival of the first Jewish settlers in the Polish lands in the medieval period. The legend holds that when the first Jewish refugees arrived in the forests of Poland after their expulsion from Western Europe, they heard a voice saying Polin, meaning rest here in Hebrew. The word that became the Hebrew name for Poland was, in this legend, a divine invitation to make a home in a place that turned out to be a home for 1,000 years. The building was designed by the Finnish architect Rainer Mahlamäki, and its interior is organized around a dramatic crack in the facade that runs from the ground to the roof, suggesting both the parting of the Red Sea and the rupture in Jewish history that the Holocaust represented. The exhibition inside tells the full 1,000-year story of Jewish life in the Polish lands. From the medieval period through the extraordinary florescence of the interwar years to the catastrophe of the German occupation and the complicated aftermath, it sits on the ground where 400,000 people once lived, most of whom were murdered during the Holocaust. Then, on the 24th of February, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within days of the invasion beginning, the main railway station in Warsaw was transformed. Volunteers appeared without being called. Translators showed up because they spoke Ukrainian and understood that translation was what was needed. People arrived carrying food and blankets and phone chargers and handwritten signs in Ukrainian that said things like, "You are safe here, and we have a room, and children welcome." Organizations that had never handled refugee assistance began handling it, learning as they went, improvising logistics in real time, coordinating through messaging applications because no formal structure existed yet to coordinate through. Within the first weeks of the invasion, an estimated 150,000 Ukrainians had passed through Warsaw. Within the first months, hundreds of thousands had settled in the city itself, the largest and fastest arrival of refugees that any European capital had received since the Second World War. The city's schools began teaching in Ukrainian. Ukrainian restaurants opened. Ukrainian language services appeared in Catholic churches. The city absorbed a new population with a speed and a practicality that reflected something about how Warsaw understood its own history, even when the people doing the absorbing were not consciously thinking about history at all. Warsaw had always been a city of people who needed somewhere to go. The Armenians and Dutch traders and German craftsmen of the 17th century, the Jewish community that had made it home for centuries, the survivors returning to Rubble in 1945, the internal migrants of the communist construction boom, the entrepreneurs of the post-communist transition, now the Ukrainians. Each arrival had shaped the city they came to, and the city had shaped them in return. That was not a policy or a program. It was simply what Warsaw had always done, without always knowing it was doing it. By 2026, Warsaw is a city of approximately 2 million people within the city limits and closer to 3 million in the broader metropolitan area. It is one of Central Europe's major financial and commercial capitals, with a concentration of international banks and law firms and technology companies that makes it one of the primary business destinations on the continent. Its university system produces graduates at a rate and quality that has kept Poland's most educated young people in Poland, rather than driving them to emigrate in the numbers that earlier economic models had predicted. Its cultural life, fed by the particular energy that comes from a society that spent 40 years being told what it was allowed to think, and has been making up for that restriction ever since, is among the most active in Europe. The old town market square is full of tourists from every direction. They come for the painted facades and the cobblestones and the restaurants and the sense of being somewhere old that is, in its current physical form, younger than most of the people photographing it. They mostly do not know the full story of what they are standing in. They do not know about the Bellotto paintings that served as blueprints, or the women cleaning bricks in the rubble, or the architects who measured 18th century oil canvases to determine the exact profile of a 17th century cornice. The story is there if they want it. The museums will tell it. The streets will tell it if you know how to read them. The brass markers in the pavement trace lines that most people walk across without knowing what they mean. The mound at Mila 18 is still there, uncleared, marking a place that is not on most tourist maps. Warsaw has always been better at surviving than at being understood from the outside. It has never particularly minded. Go back to where we started. Soviet soldiers entering a city in January of 1945 and finding something they were not prepared for. Not the chaos of a city destroyed by battle, the stillness of a city destroyed by decision. Block after block of flat rubble, extending in every direction, as far as you could see, as few as 1,000 people in a city that had held more than 1 million. Now, stand in the Old Town Market Square on any morning in 2026 and watch what happens. The coffee shops open. The pigeons arrange themselves on the cobblestones in the particular way that pigeons have always arranged themselves on these cobblestones since the Reconstruction was completed. A school group arrives from somewhere. Children old enough to be bored by history and young enough to be surprised by specific details. And their teacher is telling them something about what they are standing in. And 1 or 2 of them are actually listening. What they are standing in is not a museum. It is not a monument. It is a city, a living, functioning, argued over, complained about, loved and resented and rebuilt again city, on a river that has been running through it since before anyone thought to write down what happened on its banks. The reconstruction of Warsaw was not a miracle. Miracles do not require 30 years of labor and hundreds of architects and women cleaning bricks one at a time in the cold. The reconstruction of Warsaw was a decision, a specific, conscious, collective decision made by people who had every rational reason to make a different one, that what had been there before was worth putting back, that the memory of a city was worth the cost of making it physical again, that the intention of the people who had destroyed Warsaw was an intention that was not going to be honoured. The Kościuszko Uprising of 1794 failed, and Poland disappeared from the map for 123 years. The uprisings of 1830 and 1863 failed, and the schools taught in Russian, and the cathedral of the occupiers rose in the central square. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 failed militarily, and the ghetto was demolished to a field. But the milk cans with Ringelblum's archive survived underground, waiting to be found. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 failed militarily, and the city was reduced to 85% rubble. But the women came back and started cleaning bricks. Every act of resistance that Warsaw mounted against the forces trying to erase it failed in the immediate sense. The city is still here. This is not an argument for the nobility of failure. It is an observation about what endures. The German army that demolished Warsaw Building by building in the autumn of 1944 no longer exists. The Soviet-backed system that tried for 40 years to replace Polish memory with a more convenient version of history no longer exists. Warsaw exists. The Old Town Market Square exists. The brass markers in the pavement exist. The mound at Mila 18 exists. The people who built those things and preserved those things and refused to let those things be forgotten made choices that were not historically inevitable. They could have chosen differently. Many of them paid with their lives for choosing as they did. The ones who survived chose to come back to the rubble and start cleaning bricks. What Warsaw demonstrates, across 700 years of evidence, is not that cities are indestructible. They are not. Warsaw was destroyed. What it demonstrates is that what a city actually is, the accumulated memory of a people in a place, is harder to destroy than the buildings that contain it. You can blow up the royal castle. You cannot blow up the reason it mattered. The city on the Vistula is still here. It always found a way to be still here. And it is not finished yet.